Hello everyone, Amod here from the Target Common YouTube channel. In a web page, you might find some elements are disabled and that is for a purpose. For example, if you see this login page of this website, we are supposed to enter our email address, password, then we should click on login button. So in some applications, you might find that this login button is disabled until you enter your username and password. Another example I can give, you are placing an order from a restaurant and that allows you to cancel or edit the order only for 5 minutes. Once 5 minutes are over, cancel or edit button are disabled. Here I have a HTML code and you can see we have first text box which is enabled. Enable means we can enter some values here. But for the second text box which is grayed out and it is disabled, we cannot perform any action here. We cannot type anything. So if you see the HTML code of that element, we are using an attribute called disable. This is coming from HTML. If I remove this disabled attribute and click on run, you can see second text box is also enabled. Let me do Ctrl G. Another way we can use CSS. So for the third text box where we are using a class called disabled, you can give any name to this class name. And we need to define a style tag with the class name, and I am using some CSS properties to make the element disabled. But if you see the difference, for the second text box where I am using the disabled attribute, this is grayed out. But for the third one where I am using the CSS property, it is not grayed out. But still you cannot perform typing here. Similarly, we can use the disabled attribute for buttons as well. So you can see for the first button where I am using the disabled attribute, it is grayed out. And when I am not using any disabled attribute, then it is enabled. You can perform, click on it. So let me go back. We have another way where we have a text area, but here I am using the read only attribute. And if you see, this text area is also not grayed out, but you cannot perform typing here. So we might have multiple ways in which elements are disabled for a purpose. Obviously, we can have a logic in which your disabled elements will be enabled based on some conditions. Like you enter your username and password and then your login button will be automatically enabled. Now let's see how can we achieve this functionality in Selenium WebDriver. That means how to know whether an element is enabled or disabled using Selenium WebDriver with Java. Let's jump to IntelliJ. So I have already written the basic code where I am launching a Chrome browser and loading the HTML document, and all these HTML documents are within the resource folder of my project. This project you can clone from my GitHub. You can find the link in the description. So Selenium WebDriver provides a method called isEnabled to know whether element is enabled or not. So let's call isEnabled method on first text box and second text box where I am using the ID locator. So it will be Chrome driver dot find element by dot id. Let me copy the id value for the first text box, and this I am going to store into a web element. Let me import it, and let's use sysout and call e1 dot is enabled, and the return type of this method is a boolean. That means if the element is enabled, then to return you true, otherwise false. Let me duplicate these lines for the second text, and the id will be disabled text, and change e1 to e2. Let me quickly run this program and see the output. So for the first element it is returning true, which is obvious because the first text box is enabled. For the second one it is returning you false because the second text box is disabled. This is happy flow. Now we have a third text box where I am using a class to disable the text box. Let's call isEnabled method on this element. So for this web element I am going to use the class name disabled. So let me copy the class name, and I use Chrome driver dot find element by dot class name and pass the class name value. Let me store into web element 3 and use sysout e3 dot is enabled. Let me rerun this program. So the first two outputs we understand, but for the third one it is giving you true, but third text box is not enabled. We cannot perform typing here, but still our isEnabled method is giving you true. So this is the limitation of isEnabled method. So what is happening? This isEnabled method looks for an attribute in the web element to decide whether element is disabled or enabled. Which is that attribute? That is called disabled. So if any web element contains an attribute called disabled, then isEnabled method will return you false, otherwise true. Let me give you one more example. Here I have one text area where I am using another property called read only. Let me call isEnabled method on this text area. So I am going to use the tag name locator. Let's quickly duplicate these lines, and instead of disabled, let's put text area and it is tag name. Change E3 to E4 and run the program again. So you can see for the fourth wave element also it is giving you true, because Selenium did not find the disabled attribute in the fourth wave element. That's why it is returning you true for the fourth and third wave element here. Now let's see what will happen if we try to click on disabled element. So let me call e4.click and rerun the program. Then you might be thinking how to find whether element is enabled or not when the wave element does not contain the disabled attribute. For that you need to understand your wave element. For example, for the third text box we have a class disabled. So you may find that some class which is responsible to make the element disabled will be added to the wave element, and it might be removed based on some condition. So you may need to see the content of that class attribute. For that you can use the get attribute method and you can decide whether that class values contains any disabled class name or not. So we'll cover the get attribute method in upcoming videos. Let me show you one important concept here. So for the first text box we have the disabled attribute, and we know that isEnabled method will give me false. Let me go and try to type something on the disabled text box. So I'm using e2.sendKeys. SendKeys is a method to perform typing. So call SendKeys and here pass the string whatever you want to type. And we know that e2 is disabled. Let's see what happens now. So you can see Chrome is not closed, and if you see the console we have an exception which says that element not interactable exception. Obviously element is disabled, so we cannot perform any typing on that. Now E3 is also disabled, so let's call sendKeys method on E3 now. So just cut from here, paste below and change E2 to E3. So let me put a sleep of 10 seconds and rerun the program, and keep eye on the third text box. You can see Selenium has typed something on the third text box, but this text box is disabled. But still Selenium worked here, and it is not giving any exception, which is not the expected behavior. Now let's call sendKeys method for the fourth wave element which is also disabled, but we don't have the disabled attribute, but we have a different attribute there. So let's cut it from here, paste below and change E3 to E4. Rerun the program. So here you can see it has not typed it, but Chrome is not closed because we are using some sleep, and you can see program is successful. It has not thrown the error, but it has not typed also. So did you see some different behavior here? So if the wave element contains the disabled attribute, then only isEnabled method will return you false, and if you try to perform any action on that, it will throw an exception like element not interactable. But if you are using some different way to disable the wave element and you try to perform action, so it might be done or it may not be done, but it is not going to throw any exception. So we need to be very careful when we deal this type of elements. I hope you like the content of this video. If you have any doubt, please comment on this video. If you really like my videos, please like, comment, subscribe and share with others. Thank you everyone.